The podcast this week is going to feature a conversation I had with Pod Save America's John Favro. But first, now that we have had a few days of time to get some clarity here, a bit of a postmortem on what happened on Tuesday, how we got here, and where we go from here. Let me just say one thing to get off my chest before I get into the actual conversation, into the actual meat of it. The stolen election narrative on the right just so happened to disappear in one fell swoop the moment that Donald Trump won. In other words, after the last 4 years of these people insisting beyond any semblance of a doubt that Donald Trump lost in 2020 because of rampant fraud, apparently elections are secure again. So what happened? Democrats knew how to cheat in 2020 when they didn't have control of government, but now that they do have control of government, they, forgot how to cheat? Forgot to deploy it? I know that the sun is going to freeze over before we hear any acknowledgement from these people that they were wrong or deceived or purposefully peddling lies, but they were. And I hope that we all take into account that this encapsulates perfectly the shamelessness with which the GOP operates. A 4-year campaign, nonstop, claiming that Democrats commit fraud in elections and that our elections can't be trusted, which vanishes the instant that system worked in their favor. Just something to keep in mind. Which I suppose brings me to the crux of my argument here in discussing what went wrong. So first, we can't have this conversation without acknowledging that the global environment was horrific for incumbents. According to the Financial Times, this is the first time since 1905 that every governing party in the world lost vote share. There was a global period of inflation stemming from COVID, and even though the U.S. managed a soft landing with no recession and 16 million new jobs, the reality is that inflation means higher prices, and higher prices means that people hurt. Doesn't matter to a lot of people out there if our inflation is less bad than other countries' inflation. That's not how people think of things, right? They're not comparing their egg prices to egg prices in Portugal. They're comparing egg prices to last month's egg prices or last year's egg prices. So again, doesn't matter that we're doing better relative to the rest of the world. All that matters is that they're hurting and they're going to take it out on the people in charge, and the Democrats are in charge. I could even argue that it wouldn't matter what candidate we put forward, we were going to lose. But let's zoom into the U.S. specifically here. According to Blueprint 2024, the number one reason that swing voters broke for Trump, number one reason is, quote, Kamala Harris is focused more on cultural issues like transgender issues rather than helping the middle class. And of course, that isn't even close to true. In fact, Kamala Harris was virtually silent on trans issues in this campaign. But as far as policy is concerned, she offered $25,000 for first-time homebuyers, offered $50,000 for small businesses, advocated for raising the minimum wage, legalizing marijuana, but that's not what right-wing media showed their viewers. Right-wing media showed a quote on repeat that she made in 2019, 5 years ago, that she has since disavowed, walked away from, where she advocated for inmates in prison to get gender reassignment surgeries. And that position, regardless of the fact that she stepped away from it, was repeated millions of times on right-wing media. There was a $215 million campaign where commercials were aired nonstop, including during the World Series, showcasing that as her position. And so most people didn't know her policy positions, especially as it relates to housing or the economy or small businesses, but I can guarantee you they sure as hell did know that she was uniquely focused on gender reassignment surgeries for trans Americans. And I know that people are going to look at this and blame the Democrats for being too woke and losing the plot. You hear Elon railing against the woke mind virus, same with Joe Rogan and people like Barry Weiss and Bill Maher. The reality is that Democrats don't predicate their politics on those issues. Republicans say that Democrats care solely about those issues, and the Rogans and the Weisses and the Mahrs all accept that Republican framing. These people aren't enlightened. They're just being manipulated by right-wing propaganda, the same way that Republicans' base is manipulated by right-wing propaganda. Look, I like to think that I have a decent handle on what the Democratic Party is talking about on any given day, on any given issue. You know how many videos I've done on gender reassignment surgeries for trans inmates? 0. Literally 0. You know how many videos I've done on Kamala Harris's economic policies or housing policies or business policies? Probably hundreds. But because Fox News or right-wing media says that Harris is going woke and doing woke stuff, media figures will just take their word for it, accept their framing, and then blame the left for being too woke. And so how do we fight back? There are two ways. First, meet these people where they are and make the argument. Kind of like I'm trying to do right now. We gain nothing by avoiding Fox News and Joe Rogan because we can't validate right-wing platforms. Guess what? They're validated. That ship has sailed. They've got millions of loyal fans who listen on a daily basis. So at this point, we can go there and make our case, or we can cede that ground to people who will frame the left in a bad light, as bad a light as they can, and we'll get zero pushback. The second way is to, of course, something I've been beating the drum about, not just recently, but especially recently, is to build up progressive media and try and reclaim some fraction of the ground that we've lost. Look, I don't want to talk in sweeping generalizations here, but the left has largely lost culture. Young people, and even not young people, are consuming a ton of content that basically serves as a gateway to right-wing ideology, whether on purpose or not. Joe Rogan is a gateway to right-wing ideology. The Nelk Boys are a gateway to right-wing ideology. Theo Von is a gateway to right-wing ideology. And again, it's not necessarily intentional. Sometimes it is, but not always. But it's happening. And we have ceded that ground. And to Trump's credit and to Republicans' credit, they lay hands on every influencer on the right, big or small, because they know that by giving them an interview, that means those people get bigger audiences. And they also know that once they've validated those people will go off and do their bidding and advocate for them and speak for them. And now they've got one more mouthpiece in their party. And all it cost them was a few minutes of time, a few minutes of sitting down with those people, a moment of validating them. Democrats don't do that. Look, I've got, speaking personal experience here, I've got 3.5 million subscribers on YouTube. I've got people who I email for months and months and months and months begging for interviews, and I get ignored. I can't imagine what it's like in the broader progressive media ecosystem. And I know that Democrats are not giving interviews, not giving news stories, not giving any juicy news whatsoever to anybody other than mainstream media. And they don't do nearly enough to build up a partisan ecosystem that can then go out there and advocate for them. And by the way, this isn't everybody. There are absolutely people on the left who, come on to my shows, come on to other shows, support independent progressive media. A lot of our people get it, but not enough. And most people, by the way, this is the biggest problem, still view mainstream media as the principal outlet to make news. And every time they do that, they deprive progressive media from getting the validation that we need. Let's put it in clear terms here. Tell me the last time a Republican broke news on CBS or ABC or CNN. They don't. They give that to their people. They give it to Breitbart or the Washington Examiner or the Free Beacon or the Daily Wire. That is the asymmetry at play. One party, the Republicans, actively supports and validates and grows their media infrastructure in every way they can, and they derive the benefits on a daily basis. The other side, the Democrats, they tolerate progressive media, but that's about it. Now, with all of that said, we clearly have a lot of work to do, and we'll do it. But I do want to say that we should 100% be proud of the work that we all did over the last few months, especially if you've donated, you've volunteered, canvassed, phone banked. It all matters. It matters when you do the right thing. And it'll matter when you stay in the fight, because in the same way that Democrats watched Donald Trump get elected in 2016 and then worked hard enough to take back the House in 2018 by the biggest margin in modern U.S. history, we are going to do it again. So take the time you need, but do not check out. We've got a long fight. Again, we've got a lot of changes that we have to make, but the fight is worth it. And remember that you are not alone. We've got a massive community behind you. And if I can guarantee you anything, it's that that community is going to grow. Here's a preview of my interview with Pod Save America's John Favro. Even though we do have the more economically populist agenda, and even though we are running against somebody who is not only a billionaire himself, but has ran and not only bankrolled by the literal richest man in the world. So unto itself, already the notion that these people are going to have a populist platform that they're going to abide by is a joke. But Trump's done this before. Like, he ran on a populist platform once. When he actually got into office, all he did with his political capital was pass a tax cut that overwhelmingly favored millionaires and billionaires. I think 83% of the benefits were conferred to the richest Americans, like the top 0.1% of Americans. And so we already know that when you compare the two parties, the Democrats are actually walking the walk when it comes to actually delivering an economically populist agenda. I mean, we have, it was allowed the government to negotiate lower drug prices, cap the cost of healthcare at $2,000, automatic refunds for airline cancellations, eliminate junk fees at banks, $35 insulin. And so you have all these things where they've actually done something versus Trump just giving a tax cut to the richest Americans. So that's on the merits, but that message isn't breaking through. And as far as I think about it, it's just that we don't have a means to compete with the right's messaging distribution system. We don't have a means to compete with starting at 5 a.m. Fox and Friends, and then Newsmax and OAN and Steve Bannon's podcast and InfoWars and the Nelk Boys and 9 of the top 20 podcasts are all right-wing podcasts. Tucker Carlson, Megyn Kelly, Joe Rogan, Ben Shapiro, right? And they own YouTube and Rumble and Facebook and TikTok, and so we don't have the means to. I guess there's the problem isn't necessarily that we're not doing enough, because we do have the economically populist agenda and we're living it, but it doesn't really matter if nobody knows, because all of that information is being distorted on a daily basis. A 24-hour right-wing propaganda machine that is just spewing whatever they want to say to all the people that are consuming that. And so you can work until you're blue in the face to actually deliver results, but if nobody knows about it, if a tree falls in the woods and nobody's there to hear it, does it really matter?
Yeah. Well, here's the issue. So for a long time, the axis of the debate in America was over the size and role of government. And we talked about tax cuts, and we debated healthcare, and we debated how much the government should spend on helping people versus how many tax cuts we should give to rich people. And that was the case for most of our lives through 2012, through Obama's second term, right? And because that was the central debate in American politics, that was the debate that would get covered. And even though we didn't have the same right-wing media ecosystem then, we got that debate covered because the Republicans wanted to talk about it, we wanted to talk about it, and that's what the media covered. Now, the central debate in American politics is over identity. It is over democracy itself. It is about all the crazy shit Donald Trump does and says and threatens and then doesn't do and then does do. And how many times do we, on Pod Save America, on your show, everywhere, do we have debates about economics and the economy and all the economic accomplishments we're doing, right? I mean, Tommy and I had this, debate on Pod Save America right before the election, which is, Kamala Harris gets asked at a town hall, hey, John Kelly said that Donald Trump's a fascist. Do you agree? And of course, it's his own chief of staff said he was a fascist. Well, she didn't go up there that day and be like, I'm going to do a message of the day, fascist. But she said yes. And everyone's like, oh, now they're talking about fascism. And look, I would prefer an economic message. I thought at the time, I'm like, look, the media only covers culture wars, identity wars, Trump is a fascist stuff, democracy at stake stuff. The liberal side, we all talk about that. We don't spend a lot of time talking about the economy. So to have an economic message break through in a way where not only people who pay a lot of attention to politics, but people who barely pay attention to politics understand it, requires more than talking about your list of very good economic policies or your list of very good economic accomplishments. Because, Democrats have done a lot to help working middle-class people get people out of poverty over the last 4 years even. Joe Biden's done more than a lot of presidents. But if you're someone who hasn't been helped, right? Maybe the capping insulin doesn't personally affect you, right?
Yeah.
Maybe you didn't experience the child care tax credit, or you did, and now you're pissed that it expired, and you don't know why it expired.
But you're blaming the guy in charge.
Yeah, and you blame the person in charge. And so for the people who have not been helped, the people who have experienced hardship over the last year because of inflation, I don't know. Well, we have to have an answer for them on why. If we haven't helped them, then we have to have an answer about why we haven't been able to help them. And that answer, which I think is a good one, which is we had a bunch of Republicans standing in the way. They voted against it. But before we figure out a mechanism for getting that message to them, that has to be we just have to live that every day in a way that's like I'm thinking about Trump's next 4 years, and he's going to do a lot of crazy shit. Some of it's going to be really scary. Some of it could be really scary. Some of it could really hurt people that doesn't have to do with economic stuff. But I'm thinking, okay, everyone who voted for Trump, or a lot of people, they thought, well, I don't like him, but I had more money in my pocket when he was president, and so maybe I'll just close my eyes and not pay attention to Donald Trump and just enjoy the Trump economy. Well, now for the next 4 years, we got to be like, hey, how are you feeling about the Trump economy? Do you feel like you have more money in your pocket? Do you know that Democrats wanted to lower your health insurance premiums or lower your prescriptions even further, and Donald Trump is saying no? Do you know the Democrats wanted to give you a tax cut, but Donald Trump wants to give it to the richest people? Over and over and over again. And if we all started saying that on all of our programs, then maybe the media would cover it more.
And so is that I mean, in terms of how what happened on Tuesday is going to inform your coverage moving forward, do you think that there does have to be a stronger through line on economic populism? That issue is so resonant that even with the most dangerous candidate in American history, somebody who a few years ago incited an insurrection against the U.S. government, for them to vote largely based on the economy. I mean, the inflationary impacts across the entire world, like you just said, have led to ousters or losing ground among incumbents across the entire planet, that there's nobody that was spared. So clearly the impacts of inflation are strong, and the effects of the economy are strong. And so knowing how resonant that issue is with voters, like, is that going to inform how you guys do your jobs moving forward? And so, like, there always has to be and the economy aspect to everything that you do?
I mean, look, I think that's right to an extent. I also think I'm using the economy as an example because inflation was such a big issue in this election. But I think in general, it doesn't just have to be an economic issue that we're talking about. It does have to be an issue that has a tangible effect on people's lives, something that they can feel, right? There is a reason the Democrats did so well in midterms and special elections after Dobbs, because, like, losing access to reproductive freedom is something that affected people's lives and their families. Yeah. And so that issue could be a resonant issue for people, right? And I do think it's one thing if Donald Trump is dealing with the border, and Kamala Harris said she was going to deal with the border too, and Joe Biden did deal with the border in his last, that's one thing. If Donald Trump is going into communities and ripping people away from their families who've lived here for years and are working and are paying taxes and are doing everything right and following the law, and that just because they're immigrants that he is deporting them and tearing families apart, I think that will matter to people too, and that's something that we should talk about as well, right? But I do think we've got to think about how are people who are out there barely paying attention to politics, how are their lives being affected by what we're saying, what Donald Trump's doing, what we're proposing, and we just have to keep those folks in mind, because those are the people that we're losing, either because they're not paying attention or because they're finding Donald Trump's demagoguery and the demagoguery they hear on right-wing media, they're finding that appealing. And our question is, like, if we're going to win them back, we have to speak to their personal concerns about their lives, whether that's economic, whether that's reproductive freedom, whether that's deportations, whatever it may be. That's what we got to speak to.
And I think that it's incumbent also, like, I think it's also incumbent upon Democrats to maybe not imbue the mainstream media that is clearly not our messaging distribution system anyway, and B, not going to focus on this stuff. They're going to focus on what they focus on. Like, they're going to focus on these culture issues. Like, if somebody calls Donald Trump a fascist, that's going to lead the story for the day. And so I think it's incumbent on the Democratic politicians to recognize that there are people in the alternative media space who are actually doing the work, who are advocating for Democrats to win elections, as opposed to the New York Times and CNN and ABC, who are not advocating for Democrats to win elections, and in fact engage in a ton of both sidesism and use use their voices and their weight to kind of confer more validation onto these outlets that are actually looking out to promote the agenda of the Democratic Party, as opposed to the news outlets which aren't.
And by the way, even if the New York Times, all the headlines were perfect and all of their stories were written exactly how we want them to be written as Democrats and anti-Trump, like the whole anti-Trump coalition, right? And same thing with the Post, same thing with CNN, same thing with NBC. It wouldn't matter that much because their reach is so much different, and their reach now is college-educated people who pay close attention to the news and politics. And guess what? Democrats have those. We have those voters, and so the alternative media is important because most people in the country now are getting their news from some other source than the traditional media that we spend so much time worrying about and critiquing. Like it doesn't matter as much anymore.
And of course, to watch the full interview with John Favro, click the thumbnail right here on the screen or check out the interviews playlist on my YouTube channel. You can also click the link on the screen to listen to the audio version of this episode, and of course, to see more of my content, to stay in this fight. The subscribe button's on the screen as well.